Philosophy is notoriously difficult to define. In their introduction, Deleuze and Guattari assert that philosophy should be defined as the art of forming concepts. But of course, this is only one part of the word definition. To define means more than just fill in space, it means to set boundaries, to establish limits, to mark off where something ends. In other words, to define what philosophy is necessarily involves defining what philosophy is not. And in their introduction, Deleuze and Guattari set out to do just that. While they assert briefly that their main view on what philosophy is that it's the art of forming concepts, they then go on to describe what they think philosophy should be distinguished from, what isn't philosophy. And there are three activities in particular that they mention. These are contemplation, reflection, and communication. These are three activities that Deleuze and Guattari want us to distinguish from the activity of philosophy. So what do these terms contemplation, reflection, and communication mean here? Why don't Deleuze and Guattari think that these count as philosophy? We'll try to answer those questions and try to get more clarity on what Deleuze and Guattari have in mind. So first, let's look at contemplation. They write, philosophy is not contemplation, for contemplations are things themselves as seen in the creation of their specific concepts. This is not very straightforward. Not nearly as straightforward as their definition of philosophy, the art of forming concepts. Contrast that with contemplations are things themselves as seen in the creation of their specific concepts. Deleuze and Guattari kind of sound like they're talking in circles here. As it turns out, we get a better understanding of what they mean in that sentence if we look at a separate short statement that appears earlier on this same page, in which they refer to the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, and they write, Plato said that ideas must be contemplated, but first of all, he had to create the concept of idea. So it is presumed that the reader knows what Plato's ideas were, capital I, so we're talking about a technical notion in philosophy. It's presumed that readers will be familiar with that, and maybe a lot of readers are. Maybe if you're reading a book called What is Philosophy, you are at least aware of Plato's theory of ideas, or theory of forms, as it's also sometimes called. But it is also presumed that the reader will already know how the activity of contemplation is related to Plato and to Plato's theory of ideas, or even how the activity of contemplation is related to philosophy as a technical notion in philosophy. This is a bit of a bigger presumption on Deleuze and Guattari's part, because even if you are more or less familiar with Plato or with philosophy in general, the idea that contemplation, which arguably has almost religious connotations to it, the idea that this term could have a technical meaning in philosophy may be surprising. But as it turns out, contemplation was actually a pretty big part of Plato's philosophy and the thought of a lot of other ancient Greek philosophers. Plato was not the first or the last philosopher, particularly in ancient Greek philosophy, for whom contemplation played some part in their scheme of what kind of activities we're supposed to be engaging in as human beings. So let's take a look at what Plato thought about contemplation and a little bit about how it connected to his theory of ideas or theory of forms. And in doing so, we'll be able to come to a better understanding of why Deleuze and Guattari think contemplation should be distinguished from philosophy. Plato thought that the chief aim in human life should be to become more like God, at least as far as we're able. And to become more like God is to become less bound up with worldly concerns, like concerns about the body, concerns about sense enjoyments, sense pleasures, and instead to become more concerned with realizing attributes within ourselves, which we would ascribe to God or ultimate reality, some ultimate being. One of the ways that we do that, according to Plato, is contemplation. Contemplation of what exactly? Well, it could be a number of things. Specifically with respect to engaging in activities that get us closer to this ultimate goal of becoming more like God, contemplation may involve thinking about these attributes themselves, like virtue. If we're trying to live more virtuously, we may want to contemplate virtue itself. What does contemplation look like for Plato? Well, Plato said we need to contemplate ideas. Ideas, they're sometimes called forms, they mean the same thing. The form or idea of a thing for Plato is the essential nature of that thing. So we'll stick with our example of virtue. So there is an idea of virtue. There are instances of virtue. There are virtuous acts. But the reason that we're able to look at an action and say, yes, that is virtue, that's a virtuous act, or no, that is not virtuous. The reason we're able to say that is presumably because we've been able to contemplate the nature, the archetype of what constitutes virtue, what constitutes a virtuous act itself. So contemplation in this way is very important for Plato. And like I said, it was very important for other philosophers as well. It played a part in Aristotle's philosophy. Aristotle was, of course, Plato's student. But Deleuze and Guattari zero in on Plato, and I hope it's already becoming a little bit clearer why they've selected Plato to zero in on. Deleuze and Guattari point out that Plato's ideas and forms, that an idea or form is itself a concept. And we don't create forms or ideas. This is contained within Plato's understanding of ideas, is that they just are. They don't physically exist, but they instantiate themselves in behaviors, in objects, in people, depending on what kind of idea we're talking about. If we're talking about virtue, then virtue will instantiate itself in virtuous acts, virtuous behavior. So for Plato, we are supposed to be contemplating virtue. But Deleuze and Guattari step back and they say, well, wait a minute, how are we contemplating virtue if we don't even know what virtue is? If we take Deleuze and Guattari's definition of philosophy seriously, if we accept, at least for the time being, that philosophy is the art of forming concepts, then asking a question like, what is the essence of virtue? We're asking a conceptual question. We're asking a question about a concept, or we're trying to work our way up to a concept. And thus, we're asking a philosophical question. And we need to ask that question first before we can contemplate whatever it is that question generates, whatever answer comes out of that inquiry, which we may want to contemplate. Contemplating virtue is something that we need concepts to do. Well, we need a concept of virtue to contemplate. So philosophy has to come before contemplation. Concepts have to come before contemplation. By switching it around, by trying to equate contemplation with philosophy, or by trying to have contemplation precede philosophy, we are in effect putting the cart before the horse. This doesn't mean that Deleuze and Guattari don't think Plato is a philosopher. That would be absurd. Contemplation is not the only part of Plato's philosophy, and in fact, it's a somewhat obscure part. Even though it is an important part, it's relatively obscure. If you look at scholarship on ancient Greek philosophy, on Plato's philosophy, this is not something that has always been apparent to scholars. So why isn't philosophy contemplation? Because we need to have concepts first before we can contemplate them.